In this episode of the Custom Mob series, I'm going to show you one of the many different possible ways to implement natural spawning for your custom mob. This method only requires 10 commands, and I'm going to walk you through how it all works, how to customize it for your own mob, and also I'll provide an example pack. Make sure to check out more information in the description below, such as the table of contents for this video and the example download. Okay guys, so for naturally spawning your mob, this method that I'm going to show you is basically what it's going to do is it's going to take a random selection of whatever mob that you want to replace and just replace a random amount of them, and the frequency of the random replacement is going to be determined by whatever you want it to be. So if you want your mob to be really rare, then you could just change the number, and if you want it to be really common, then you can just decrease the number. And this method will be replacing existing mobs, but you could make it not replace the mobs and just spawn on top of them if you want, so it doesn't really matter too much, but I personally prefer with replacing the mob because that can cause lag. So I'll give you a basic explanation first, and then I'll show you how I'm going to make it work with commands. So basically how it's going to work is, let's pretend that we have all of these mobs. Let's say we have these 5 fish, right? So the salmon, pretend this is the normal mob, and the tropical fish is the special mob, so our own custom mob. So what it's going to do is, so pretend this was already a salmon, right? So how it's going to work is we're going to have a scanning system that's going to randomly scan each of these individually one by one, and then what it's going to do is it's going to determine if it should replace it with the custom mob. So how we're going to do that is we have a scoreboard counter to count how many are being spawned in. And every time that we scan one of these normal eligible mobs to be replaced, then it will increment by 1. So the first time it does it, it will be at 0. And when it's at 0, it's going to spawn the custom mob. So it's going to go, okay, scanning the first random mob. Okay, it's at 0. Now let's set it to a custom mob and kill the old mob. Now it's going to go to 1. And now the counter is at 1. And then it's going to say, okay, it's not at 0, therefore keep the mob and don't replace it. Then it's going to go to 2 and do the same thing. It's going to say, okay, it's not 0, so don't replace it. Don't replace it. And then once it gets to 4, or whatever number you select in order to change the frequency of your custom mob, once it gets to that number, it's going to say, okay, I'm going to set a normal mob, but now we have to reset it back to 0. So now the next time it goes to detect another mob to scan it and see if it's going to replace it, it's going to say, oh, back to 0, now let's replace it. Now, as you could see, by changing this maximum number, you could change the frequency of your mob. So if this is 4 right now, if I changed it just to 2, then we're going to have more of our mob. And if I changed it to 1, then it's going to be 50%, because it's just going to go between 0, 1, 0, 1. So it's just going to go custom mob, normal mob, custom mob, normal mob. So you could change that number to whatever you want, so it's really flexible in how frequent you want your mob to spawn. So the first part that we have to set up is the scoreboard and the fake player. So some of you might have not used fake players before, but I'll try to explain it, and it's pretty simple in how it works. So first we're setting up a normal dummy scoreboard. So scoreboard, objectives, add, and I just call it CM underscore example, CM for custom mob. It could be whatever you want to call it. And dummy. So that means it's changed by commands only, because we want to tally it up every time we do a scan, and we don't want any other interactions with the scoreboard other than our commands. So it's just going to be called dummy. And now we set up a fake player. So a fake player is in a scoreboard basically used like a normal variable, just a way to store information. And the reason I'm using a fake player instead of assigning it to an actual entity is because there's no entity here. We're trying to keep track of the count of the total mobs that are being scanned at the moment, so we don't want to assign it to a normal entity. If you remember when we used scoreboards for my right-click tutorial with the carrot on a stick, we had the scoreboard not on a fake player, but on the actual player using the stick, because we're trying to track it for each individual player. But for here, we're trying to track the entire custom mob type. So what I'm doing is scoreboard, players, add, 0, and that's just to initialize it, because if you don't add 0 and there's no score, then it won't be able to detect it later. That's just a little trick to use to make sure that your commands are able to detect a number, because when you create a scoreboard, all entities don't automatically get a value of 0. They just don't have any value. So you basically have to initialize the scoreboard by adding 0. And the fake player is called mob1count. So it's basically just a random variable called mob1count that's going to be stored in the side. So normally it would be a player name here. So for me, it would say Ryan Ethan and have like a number here. But in my case, I'm using a fake player just to store the number. Okay, so now I'll show you all of the commands that I use to make this work. So first we have the scoreboard objective creation, which I showed you just now, and the setting to 0, which I showed you just now, just to make sure that we could actually detect the scoreboard value of 0 instead of having no score there. So this is just going to be the counter for mob 1. If you have a different mob, or it's called, for example, Crimson Serpent, then I would just put like CS for Crimson Serpent _ count. It doesn't matter, just as long as you keep track of what you're naming it, and just try to keep it consistent. But now what we're going to do is I'm going to show you this command here. So this command is basically just scanning all of the type of mob that I want to replace. So in my case, it's zombified piglins that I'm going to scan and replace a random amount of. So execute as all of these mobs that are eligible to be replaced. And I want to make sure they don't have the tag of not mob1, because I'm going to add that on later on. And the reason that I'm doing that is to make sure that once I scan it, I make it clear to the game, or clear to my commands actually, that I already scanned it, because I don't want to keep re-scanning all of them, because if I infinitely scan all of them without signifying that they've already been scanned, then eventually all of them are going to be scanned and replaced to be the custom mob. So once a mob scanned, I want to just scan it once and that's it. So I tag it to make sure that it doesn't scan twice. So then I also do sort equals random to make sure that it randomly picks the mobs from around the map. And then I go to their positions, because I want to make sure when I run the summon command that it actually summons on the position of that mob. And then run the function of mob demo mob1 spawn, or whatever mob you want it to be. So in order to make that, you could just create a new text file the exact same way that you created the loop function. And if you don't know where all of these came from, make sure you go watch my how to create a data pack video and download the template. So with that said, let's move on to this function, which you could just create as a new text file. Just make sure you add .mc function to the end of it. So it looks like a lot here, but most of it is just the big summon command that we made in the last video. So what we're doing here is, if it's 0, remember how I said we're running the spawning if it reaches 0. So I'm doing execute if the score for the player mob1count, which is actually a fake player, and the scoreboard of CM example. So that's the example scoreboard that we were doing. So custom mob example, that's just the name of the scoreboard that we were using to track the counts of the mob. And if it matches 0, then we are going to summon it. So basically, if the scoreboard's at 0, we're going to run the summon command. And then this is the exact same thing. If the mob1count is at 0, then we are going to teleport the mob down into the void so that it will die without leaving its loot everywhere, and so you won't see the mob like dying randomly when you see custom mob spawn. So that's what happens if it matches 0. But even if it doesn't match 0 and we don't want to spawn the mob, there are still things we have to do. So every time we just add the tag not mob1 just to make sure that it doesn't scan again, because even though the mob is getting teleported into the void, we still don't want it to be double scanned, because there's no point in that. So we're just tagging all of these mobs with not mob1 just to show that it has been scanned and it has been determined to not be replaced with the custom mob. We are also adding one to the mob1 count, so scoreboard, players, add, and then which player, mob1 count, the fake player, and which scoreboard, CM example, which is the scoreboard we're using to count the players, or count the mob, sorry. And we're just incrementing that by 1 so that we can continue to see if we are going to replace the next one with a custom mob or not. And then also this is for resetting the count. So execute if the score for mob1 count with the scoreboard of CM underscore example matches 3. So this number here, 3, this can be whatever number you want in order to determine the frequency. So if I set it to 300, then you're going to have a very, very rare custom mob. And if you set it to like 2, then it's going to be like a 1 in 2 chance or something like that. So you can just set that number to whatever you want and just tweak it based on the rarity of the mob that you want. And then so if it does match 3, then what we do is we run scoreboard players set mob1 count cm example 0. So we're just setting the count down to 0 again so that the next time the mob will spawn, it will be a custom mob. This will be for download, and I will continue posting new downloads as we work on this custom mob series. But the main things that you want to be able to change if you're just going to use the download is change this number here in order to be whatever frequency you want. Higher number means more rare. And you also want to change all the scoreboards. So for me, that would be CM example. You could do CM underscore Nether, for example, if you're making another mob pack. Just change the scoreboards and change the fake player. So maybe you're not going to call it mob1. Maybe you'll call it wraith underscore count or whatever custom mob you have. Just try to make it your own. And of course, change the summon command to whatever summon command you made in the last video. And for the last thing that you'll change is the type of mob that you're going to be replacing. So for me, that's the zombified piglin. But of course, if you're making an overworld mob, you would probably want to change that to like a zombie or a creeper or something like that. And also something I want to say is if you're going to be adding multiple mobs, you don't need to create a new scoreboard. Just keep on using this example scoreboard for all the custom mobs that you'll be spawning with this method in your data pack. So I'm using CM example here. All you have to do is duplicate this, so you just do scoreboard players add mob2 count CM example 0. So you could use the same scoreboard with multiple fake players in it for each of your custom mobs, and add another spawn function. Okay, so here's what it looks like after you code the whole thing. So as you can see right now on the side, the custom mob example counter has the fake player value or variable value for mob1 count of 0, and that's how it'll start out. And I also changed the max number in order to match this. So how it's going to work is it starts at 0, so the first scan on a random mob that fits your criteria for whatever you want to replace will have a custom mob. So as you can see, that zombie pigman got replaced with the crimson serpent. But now as I go to the next one, as you can see, it's a normal one because this mob1 count is not set to 0. And here it's not set to 0, so it's still normal. And now once we get to here, it's going to detect that it's 4, but then it's going to rise up back to 5, and it's going to detect it's too high, then it's going to reset back to 0, which means that once we go back around to here, it's at 0, and it'll make another custom mob during the next scan. And it will just keep going through that cycle until there are no more mobs to scan. And when mobs do scan, then it'll just keep going on and on. So as you can see, it doesn't look random when you're just spawning them in order, but again, when you're actually doing it in a real world, you're not going to notice it at all since it's not just a line of mobs being summoned. So hopefully you guys understood this tutorial and you guys are able to use it to make your own custom mobs. And remember, the template will be in the description below.